Hey everyone, and welcome to today's event. I'm Yulia from UXPressia. Let me give you a brief overview of who we are and why we're here today. We at UXPressia are a team of people passionate about helping others create better experiences. UXPressia is an online customer journey mapping platform where you can build customer journeys, or employee journeys for that matter, and impact maps, create personas, and do that all with your teammates in real time. We also offer consultant services and conduct public and corporate workshops to educate companies and individuals. And we've got UXPressia Academy that has interactive courses on mapping, personas, and interviews. And of course, our free community events. Companies have been talking about customer centricity for a while now. But what about the employees? Today, we will put them first and talk about the employee journey mapping and improving the onboarding through it. Our today's guest expert isn't here for the first time, as we did an interview on employee experience last year. After years working on the user experience for customers and the onboarding process for software products, he found that most organizations he worked at spent little to no time investing in their employee onboarding experience. Now, as the founder of Playficient, a consultancy that helps organizations focus on what matters in the employee experience, he makes this big change. Welcome everyone, Paul Lopushinsky.
So everyone, thanks for joining. Thanks again for having me, UXPressia. So we're going to talk about how to improve employee onboarding with employee journey mappings. We're going to be focused specifically on the topic of employee onboarding. So as was mentioned earlier, my name is Paul Lopushinsky. Just note, you might see a few things pop up here on the screen, just due to being co-host. So those will tend to go away after a bit. In case you're wondering how to pronounce my last name, it's Lopushinsky. I've heard, pretty much every wrong pronunciation under the sun, but that's the way of doing so. So if you want to type a moment in the chat, what led you to signing up for this event on improving onboarding with employee journey mapping? I know some of you kind of mentioned it earlier about like the yes or no. So I'm just kind of curious to hear what led you to signing up for this event. Increase your knowledge on the topic. Is there anything specific about the knowledge? Training specialists looking to improve their onboarding experience. Onboarding could be a mess, yes. Remapping, make it more cohesive. Perfect use of words. Good process for enterprise. How to build journey mapping, you need to do customer journey mapping. Continue to focus on employee experience and how we further build capabilities to drive higher levels of individual organizational performance. See how it might be different from regular journey mapping to ensure that we offer our employees the best experience, gain ideas and inspiration around onboarding and employee experience. So, and also I was just mentioning here earlier, so it'd be any different than regular journey mapping. So it's not a whole lot different than customer journey mapping beyond, who you're focusing on and some of the steps towards it. A lot of the fundamentals are going to remain the same. Boss recommended it. See what this is all about. You're organizing employee journey mapping sessions with their clients to improve the employee experience. Use UXPressia, perfect. Yeah, on online sessions to COVID. Good stuff. So if anyone keeps typing more, I'll also be keeping my eye on the chat. So just my phone's below in case I'm looking down. So, we of course, this last year with COVID, we've all seen plenty of different changes in so many ways, right? From onboarding to the employee experience, work commutes being gone, how people are working, depending on where you are in the world. Like I'm here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Restrictions are slowly starting to go away. At the time being, you never know, things might change. Talk about going back into the office, some as soon as July, some maybe in September. It's kind of like what's happening next when it comes to, are people going to be working in the office? Are people going to be fully remote? Is it going to be hybrid? I'm sure you've all had plenty of discussions at your organizations on that front. But what does that also mean for the onboarding experience? I've known people who were onboarded right around when COVID happened. And it was fairly chaotic. Like for my sister, for example, 2 days into when she started her new job, there was the call to everyone has to work from home. So her onboarding was a little bit shifted up and down as a result. So again, I have a few prompts throughout the presentation here just to get your brains jogging. So I want to hear about what changed at your organization's onboarding over the last year, or also in the chat if you want to type in briefly. Maybe you went through an onboarding experience around the time when restrictions really kicked in. So just take a moment to type what changed about your onboarding over the last year. Thanks for the divider. That'll make it easier to see the answers too. Start persona building initiative, gather insight for remote, and eventually journey mapping. Like completely virtual. Now, was that something new for your organization? Was there a mixture of it before? Or was it all in the office? Something new, yeah. We're all in the office. We all onboarding through YouTube videos. Oh, that's interesting. Zoom onboarding. Less personal contact than you would like, but still trying to onboard new employees as good as we can. Emotional connection with new team members. One of our core values is building meaningful relationships. Okay, very interesting. So I think a lot of it, I had to see in the last year too, talking with organizations is, depending on where your company was, maybe you had this, the super fancy office that had all the bells and whistles, that had, the ping pong table, maybe had, beer on tap if you're one of those like trendy tech companies who follow in that route. But I saw a lot of it at the end of the day, really being the case is when you take all that away, like what do you really have when it comes to your employee experience? And a lot of it really comes down to those values. There's a great quote from William Shakespeare from Richard III of why grow the branches when the root is gone. So with what happened in the last year, I think that's really taken away all those branches and got a lot of organizations and individuals to look more at the root of what's the core of your onboarding or the core of your employee experience. So I know as I look at some of these answers here about uh, you know less personal contact, everyone went virtual, Zoom onboarding. I know someone mentioned YouTube videos. So as much as that's changed onboarding with how we've gone about it, the fundamentals of onboarding don't really change. It's still, I have a list here of five goals. I think it doesn't matter what organization you are, what industry you're in, what size you're in. These are 5 things that you should always be focusing on your onboarding. And that's being, from day one, new employees know they made the right choice in joining your organization. They might have had multiple other offers, but they decide to join your organization. And you don't want them thinking, when lunchtime rolls around on day one, if it's a case of, oh, what if maybe this wasn't the right choice, maybe I should have looked elsewhere. You really want to get them right and early on, saying like, okay, I've made the right choice. Giving employees everything they need to know, but we're afraid to ask. We've all been in that situation of working at various organizations where onboarding was a bit lackluster. And it's like, well, do I want to be that new person who's constantly bugging people? I don't know where to get this information. I don't want to rock the boat in a way. I know other people have all their work they're busy to do. Um, you know, easing them into their organization. I find a lot of organizations just tend to, and I've been in this position before, they just kind of chuck them in the ocean without a life jacket. And I'm more about, okay, let's get them to dip their toe in the pool first and let them get adjusted to it as a result. Showing them that your organization, how it works, like your values. I know someone was mentioning here about building meaningful relationships. That's something you always want to demonstrate very early on, how your team works and your organization, and show them that their work matters. You could have all these other things, but if you're not showing, right off the bat that their contribution is appreciated and great for your organization, for your team, it doesn't really matter. I'm sure we've all been in situations where when you joined an organization, when you had the interview process and you signed the paperwork, it seems like, they couldn't wait for you to get started. And then by the time you got there, it kind of felt like, am I being taken for granted here? So here's two gifts I find of very large differences in what we want onboarding to be. So pretty much all my onboarding experiences more or less have been like John Travolta here from Pulp Fiction on the left, maybe walking in the office, confused, not sure where to find information, not sure who to talk to. And of course, now with everything being on Zoom, this also looks the same way too. And here on the right is, I've only had one onboarding experience during my time where it was, there's a quote about how, onboarding, you're basically joining a party that people have been at for years. So that's kind of what you're doing here, is you want to kind of introduce them. So I'm just looking at the chat here. For organizations, their desk situation is quite rigid, has their own desk, actually desk space. My onboarding is just more on the right side, perfect, just virtual. And that's the thing. It's been a lot more difficult, especially when people adjusted early on, all the new technologies and everything. But at the end of the day, that the main focus still is those fundamentals of onboarding, of getting them off on the right foot, of getting them feeling like they made the right choice. So just, some brief stats. I'm sure we've all been seeing at various points. So from Gallup, only 12% of employees agree that their organization did a great job with onboarding. OC Tanner found about 69% of employees are more likely to stay with a company for 3 years or more. They experience great onboarding. With most individuals can be gone within a year. So when it comes to your employee onboarding experience, one of the best things you could do is to, create a foundational journey for it. That every story will be different for every individual who comes in at, a junior role or senior role, comes in maybe as a software developer, someone in the legal department, in HR and finance, that all their stories are going to be different, but the foundation should be the same. So on the right here, I have this image of the hero's journey. There's going to be a lot of story-based analogies throughout this presentation. So this might take you back to your high school classes where you learned about some of this material. This comes from Joseph Campbell of like a story structure that's kind of been implemented over time if you look at any kind of stories. And that's what we're going to be using when we make use of journey mapping. So what everything, of course, is about here today is about the employee journey map. So this is like a very high level view of it, very nice drawing of it. And of course, what we're going to be focusing on here is the induction and onboarding. I love using Campbell for journey mapping perfectly. I love that you make use of Joseph Campbell. Good reading material. I think, Joe, you'll know the book. Is it The Hero of a Thousand Faces? I think that's his most well-known book. So for example, here's UXPressia. Here's an example. And they have templates on the website, and they'll talk about it after my portion's done. Here's like how like a remote onboarding journey map can look like. So just because of our limited time here, we're not going to go, we'll cover some of that, but I know some of you were typing in the chat earlier about yes or no, but I'm curious more of how familiar are you with journey mapping? Is this something, I know this was asked at the beginning, but I just kind of want to get more specifics here. Is it a case of you've never heard of it before? I know some of you said your boss told you to come here, but you're a beginner. I know some of you have said you have made use of them before. Beginner, basics, quite familiar, but no experts yet. Only done customer journey mapping with our customers, never with internal. Done it, it's fun, currently using it, not familiar at all. Familiar with still learning. Not familiar, perfect. So, so I mentioned that they've used it for customer journey mapping. So it's not overly different in the way it's, of course, the information that you're picking up is going to be different than customers. But a lot of the foundations, like if you've used Bill, I see you mentioned, yeah, customer journey mapping. If you've done that with customers, a lot of the the foundations do carry over more to the employee experience. So really what it is, it's a breakdown of the major moments, or if we're going to make story analogies, plot points, and the end-to-end experience for employees. And it really helps you to identify the strengths and shortcomings in the experience. So if you go on UXPressia's website, here's some examples of clients they have and who've made use of. I think you said it was mostly customer journey. These people are using it for customer journey maps. Bill says, yeah, the customer journey map templates are awesome. Thoroughly enjoyed the guidance throughout. Yep, and there's a couple of employee experience based templates as well on their website. Yep, there we go. Perfect. Right there in the chat. So there's not, when it comes to research on employee journey mapping, there's not a whole lot of statistics or information, but when you look more at customer journey mapping, that 85% of those of organizations who use customer journey mapping report its positive or very positive impact. And nearly 3/4 believe that their customer journey mapping projects have led to an increase in customer satisfaction, which really leads to higher NPS scores, which leads to better sales and better revenue. So if we're going to take this process inward and apply it and have a positive impact, we're going to see things of, greater retention rates, higher employee satisfaction. And what's so great about, journey mapping is, storytelling is one of our oldest and most powerful tools that are ingrained in us. Way back in the day when we were, living in caves and grunting at one another, you could still see those cave drawings. We were telling stories to one another, around fireplaces, and we still do, through books and movies and just any form of interactive media. And we're very much visual creatures, right? Where I'm sure we've all heard the expression, "A picture tells a story of 1,000 words." So journey mappings are really a great combination of words and images. It helps you build stories of the processes and thoughts and feelings of what people go through during this process. So a great analogy I like to make use of when it comes to journey mapping is actually thinking of your journey map, like a physical map, like a world, breaking it down to four: the world map, like a country map, state, province, county, district map, city map. So the entire employee experience is going to be the world map. But then you want to zoom in more and get more specific. So for example, here for more of a visual representation, we have a world map in the top left here. This would be your entire employee experience. And then you would zoom in. So I'm in Canada. So here would be the Canadian map or the country map of Canada. And this is more the overall onboarding. And then you could zoom in further. So I'm based out of British Columbia. Zoom in further to the province, and that's where you get even more specific. This is where you could start getting into the details of all the things you do in your onboarding process. And then you could zoom in even further if you want to get very specific. So I'm based out of Vancouver. So this is like a map of the downtown area of Vancouver. So think of the overall onboarding experience. Think of it like a country that, each country, or in this case, organization, is going to be different. But best practices have emerged over time of what makes a good onboarding experience. So again, to reiterate, as I mentioned earlier, uh, and whenever you're building your onboarding, you could go about it in many different ways. But making sure that you target these, that you got them off on the right foot, that they feel like they made the right choice in joining. They didn't feel like they were, they signed a bill of goods that was completely different than what they actually got. Giving them everything they need to know, but were afraid to ask, easing them into the organization, showing them how your organization works, and showing them that their work matters. So there's 3 questions throughout whenever you're working on any kind of step in the the employee experience, or in this case, onboarding, in this journey map here. Is these 3 questions: is what is the employee trying to do? What is the employee feeling? And what kind of barriers are getting in the way? So this is zoomed in on some of the information when it comes to employee onboarding. Um, so for example, here, I'm feeling excited, nervous, scared all at once. My head is going to explode. I don't want to be seen as a bother. It'd be nice to receive a 2-pager of what to expect for Monday if this is just before they started. It's always thinking about what are they feeling, and kind of potentially identifying those barriers that can potentially get in the way. And where these insights will come from. Now, there's a whole topic about personas, which, due to the limited time today, I'm not going to get into. Personas being, you building these kind of case studies of individuals who could go through the experience. But the best way to do so is think about your past experiences, but also those who've recently gone through the onboarding experience. Um, I give much more weight to those who've recently gone through the onboarding experience, because you might be at your organization for, say, 5-6 years, and maybe the onboarding experience is completely different than when you started. Maybe the company's doubled or tripled in size since you began. So things are completely different. But going and talking with individuals at your organization, um, of their experiences of recently going through onboarding, can give you a lot of great insight of what kind of things were they feeling. It might be a case of, like, this individual says, oh, my head's going to explode, with all the information that they were getting. So if we take this country map, this onboarding, and we zoom in further, so if we look at the provinces, the states, counties, districts, whatever you want to call it, we could start looking at some of the ways of creating a better employee onboarding experience. So I have a list of about a dozen or so ways of improving the onboarding experience. Some are quick wins. Some are more based around what I call social media friendly. And then some are more like I feel that deliver the most value. So the ones that deliver the most value, I find, are the buddy system, the entry interview, which is kind of like a AKA get to know them talk, the 30, 60, 90-day plan, and the stay interview. So I'm just going to cover, just with the limited time, I'm just going to briefly cover the first 2 of the buddy system and the entry interview. So before I cover some of these, I'm curious in the chat, what are some things that your organization does for the employee onboarding experience? Are there any kind of specific tools or techniques? For example, do you make use of a buddy system? What kind of things do you do before I go on to talk about them? Oh, good question. Yeah, about Bill's, from about HR to UX designer. I'm actually going to talk about that in a few slides, actually, about that, of who kind of takes ownership of it. 360, 90 plans focuses on the paperwork to everyone each on the journey. Yeah, 30, 60, 90 plans, a very common one, which I have. Yeah, definitely more about the ID plan, buddy for organized tea, coffee, different colleagues, weekly coaching moments, employee focus on being really helpful, peer coaches to assign to new team members, touch point from there, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months, and 1 year. Perfect. Touch points is, yeah, that's very good term to use for this. Buddy system, mentors, project managers, perfect. So just talking briefly about the buddy system, I know a lot of you have already mentioned that you make use of it. If you don't do so already, or if you want some ways of tweaking it, so there was a Microsoft study. They did a pilot program with buddies, and they found that 56% of new hires who met their onboarding buddy at least once in the first 90 days, excuse me, indicated that their buddy helped them to quickly become more productive in that role. And this increased to nearly 100%. They met more than 8 times during the first 90 days. So one thing to think about is, I know some organizations, I'm also curious for those in the chat too who do make use of the buddy system, is do you make it a voluntary or mandatory process for people to be buddies to new employees? But also, how many buddies should a new employee have? That's something I see a lot of organizations will do, where they only really focus on one buddy. So if we go back to those 3 questions again, of what is the employee trying to do? What is the employee feeling? And what are the barriers getting in the way? So here's some insights I've picked up from people when it comes to the buddy system and how they felt about it. And some of these also come from my experiences too, of, oh, like, I wonder what my buddy will be like. Will we get along? Because I've had experiences where I was concerned that the individual was going to kind of cloud my vision of everything, because they were very opinionated, although we didn't quite exactly get along. But, oh, I have multiple buddies. So that's why I always encourage organizations to make sure, when you can, if it's available, to have multiple buddies, to make sure you gain different insights within the organization. In some cases, just the way people are, I'm not sure what we should be talking about during our meetings. Oh, they provided us a list of questions I could ask to help keep the conversation going. That's very nice of them. For the buddy system, I think 2 at least. One is experienced, one is fairly new like themselves. And yeah, being able to, yes, that's also a very good point, is I sometimes find it's a bit overlooked that fairly new employee, I don't mean someone who just joined like 2 months ago, but someone who's been around not too long, but's gone through the experience. They have a really good idea of what they would, they were recently the new guy or the new girl, and just trying to navigate their way through the organization. So they have a lot of great insight into that. So moving on to the entry interview, I brought this up in various presentations. People are like, oh, what is the entry interview? And like, how does it differ than it's basically a getting to know them kind of talk. It really, whether done by someone from HR, whether by their manager, this really helps gain a better understanding of their interests, their values, their preference, their skills, career aspirations. And this is different than the job interview, in the sense of the questions you're at. A lot of the questions might be similar, but you also have to remember, now that they have the job, you could start getting a little more specific and digging in deeper into the conversation here. And now that they're part of the organization, they'll give you different answers, as opposed to, answers in the interview process, which is more, I'm trying to get this job. Here's the answers I've crafted for you. So first, when you do these kind of these entry interviews, you always want to think about open-ended questions of, what would you like to see from your manager? What potential barriers? And there's that the thing about barriers again. What potential barriers do you see getting in the way? How can we help remove them? And then you always want to dig deeper into some of these questions. You always, there's something called the 5 whys, which you might be familiar with. And with the 5 whys, you're really digging in deeper of when someone gives you answer at face value, you want to ask like a why-based question around it. If someone's looking for strong mentorship, for example, as an answer, you want to say, why do you want strong mentorship? And then they might say, oh, I didn't get strong mentorship in the past. And why didn't you get strong mentorship in the past? And so on and so forth, until you really get down to the whys of what their answer really is. So again, if we're going back to these 3 questions here of what they're trying to do, what they're feeling, and what barriers are getting in the way, they might think more at first. It's like, oh, well, what's the point of the entry interview? Didn't I already answer these questions when I applied for the job? They might get a little anxious about it, but then you kind of have to say, oh no, this is about helping me with any barriers that might get in my way, my working style, and that's what I want from them as a manager. But also they'll get some really great insights into themselves if you ask some really quality open-ended questions and you get curious and you dig from there. They might learn a lot more about themselves than maybe even you did from that side of the table. So that what was asked earlier is who is working on the employee journey map? Someone was mentioned, is this a UX thing? Is this an HR thing? Ideally, it's going to be spearheaded by people, people and culture, HR. In the sense, in some of your organizations, you might have people like the customer journey map has been worked on by user experience. So there could be a lot of great, I think, Bill, you mentioned that your organization does make use of customer journey mapping. So insights in how to build those out can greatly be implemented into employee journey mapping. There are differences, of course, in between the two as far as gathering information. It tends to be, a lot easier to gather information from employees. I mean, if you're in the office, you could just turn to the person next to you or just have a quick Zoom call. I do know some insights will be different than customers. I find customers tend to be a lot more blunt about things. Employees might be like, oh, things are good here. They don't maybe want to just they don't want to rock the boat. For example, if you ask someone about who recently went through the onboarding process, they might be, they're new to the team. They might not give like 100% useful answers in the sense that they're like, oh, I don't want to be seen as a troublemaker or whatnot. That's something to always consider. But at the end of the day is the more people you have insight giving into the employee journey map, although it should be spearheaded by people and culture or HR. The more people that you can get insights from, the better. So it's not a case of just locking yourself in a room or Zoom calls and think you have all the answers. Some don't want to be seen as high maintenance. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, they don't want to be in that kind of position. So I'm just the one thing to consider here as well. When it comes to this is, so you don't want to just block yourself away and then come back and be like, here's our journey map. And you also have to consider, and this is a whole topic in of itself, personas, which is kind of laying out, oh, here's someone who's starting a role in marketing. Here's someone starting a software role just out of university. Here's someone coming in at a vice president level. And also you have to consider what I'm focusing on here is new employee onboarding, but you also have to consider, and this could be a whole talk in of itself, is, people get cross-boarding, I guess, in the sense, someone who goes from one role to say a senior role goes to a vice president role. What kind of onboarding do they get? A lot of the fundamentals here are still going to remain the same. So that's where I was talking about the more specific you get, you start from that world map and you go down to the country map, for my analogies, to the province, state, county map, going down to a local map. Once you get more to a local map, that's when you can start to get a lot more specific for individuals. Maybe they're coming in a marketing role, if they're coming in a software role. how their journey is going to be different. So for example, someone in software development is going to have a very different journey than someone in finance, but you want to have that foundation be the same. It's, it's like telling stories, right? There's the hero's journey with Joseph Campbell. That's a pretty solid foundation for stories. Not, of course, not every story makes use of it, but it's one that pretty much everyone's familiar with. And it's from there that you could go on and create different stories. So one thing about maps as well, if we're going to continue with the analogies, if you look at, say, a world map doesn't really change a whole lot over the last little while, right? It's, maybe some borders might shift every once in a while, or it's more once you zoom in further, right? If you zoom into a local, if you ever go on, how do you avoid a one size fits all story? That's a great question. Can we park that for the Q&A? But hold on to that question. Um, so unlike a map, you should always be tweaking and improving your journey map. This is not like, say, like a one and done process. It's not like you chart the map and everything's done. You want to even think of it here zoomed in like Google Maps. If you ever go to Google Maps and you look at the street view, you always see things are changing, right? Google will go take photos every once in a while. Buildings are being built up. Buildings are being, businesses are getting shut down, especially over the last year. So the case with journey mapping is you always want to be tweaking it. You always want to be identifying the shortcomings in your onboarding. You want to be implementing that feedback or implementing the improvements, and then also obtaining that feedback, and then continuously building in and out. So always making sure there's things to work on. So as been mentioned in the chat here, UXPressia does have a couple of templates, and which I featured throughout the presentation here, of which we'll talk about after my portion's done here, that you can make use of. This one here that we're looking at, I think it's focused on remote onboarding. Here's one that's more focused on kind of a brief overview of the entire employee experience. So as I mentioned here, we're getting close to the Q&A. It's okay to feel a bit overwhelmed. For example, I haven't even touched anything about personas, which we could talk about in the Q&A, and also the one size fits all stories. And we only talked about the onboarding portion of journey mapping. There's pre-boarding, there's ongoing engagement, there's feedback, review, there's like the retire, resign, fire section. There's about 10 or 11 or so what I call best practices of the journey map. And we've only really focused on onboarding. So it's okay if you feel like this individual here are completely overwhelmed. And another quote from an excellent story of nothing is so painful to the human mind as a great and sudden change. So maybe after we're done here, you're feeling, really great of like, all right, let's go revamp our entire onboarding process. Let's start getting a journey map. Like, let's start working on this right away. And I appreciate the enthusiasm. That's always a great way to end up getting resistance, whether from your bosses or whatnot, or you might end up burning yourself out. So once we're done here today after this workshop and after the Q&A, like what's one thing you could do to start improving your employee onboarding through employee journey mapping? So I'm curious, is it setting up a meeting with your boss? Is it, looking at UXPressia, looking at some of the templates? Is it reviewing what you learned here? What's one small thing you could do to start improving your employee onboarding through employee journey mapping? One process, continue to fine tune our journey, break it further down by audience. The templates to make more than one process fits all. Looking at templates, I have a map if I ever get assigned a buddy. So just a few more things here as just before we get to the Q&A. So as mentioned earlier, I did do a talk with UXPressia on employee journey mapping. I think it was last October, I want to say. It's up on their blog, and they also recorded it, interview employees to identify friction points. I love that term. That's a very great term, friction points. Implement foundational journey. So this talk I did, it's more of an interview that I was given a whole batch of questions about journey mapping. This one is more broad, focusing on the employee experience. But I do think some aspects of onboard came up, and that'll be included in the email that gets sent out afterwards. And there's also a video recording of it. Reviewing templates to start creating an onboarding journey to have a fluid and impactful onboarding experience, to keep valuable employees, involve the new employees more, and use less assumptions and gain more feedback from them. So that's great that you said use less assumptions. Yeah, link that in the chat. Yeah, all the links will be shared. That's the great thing about assumptions. I'm sure there's a great expression of when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. So whenever you can, try not to make assumptions. Some of this information here, over the last couple of years, I've collected all this information on various people and culture books, articles. I'm kind of an oddball, and I'll even read academic papers in some cases. A lot of things on the employee experience. So whether that's, journey mapping, design thinking, employee experience, employee onboarding. So I have make and test your assumptions. Yes, that's perfect. So I have what I call this Playficient culture brain. I update usually on a weekly basis of all of these notes I've taken and kind of how they all connect to one another. So I'm currently having that as a lifetime access. So pay what you want if that's something you're interested in. So it's just basically where I dump all my notes in for various things I come across from articles, books and whatnot. And that will be provided in the link as well. And this is something that literally, I think it's just like Monday we put it up. I've been working with this organization out here in Vancouver called People Managing People. We've been in the talks about doing an employee onboarding masterclass. So this would probably be, we don't have like a date yet. So there's more, if you're interested, there'll be the wait list that you could join of 5 live online sessions. So it'd be like a cohort-based system, like once a week for 90 minutes per session. And we'll talk about different topics each week, as well as have open discussions and questions with real-time feedback about creating a world-class employee onboarding experience. So that will also be included in the links as well for the email that will be sent out afterwards. So now we're at the Q&A time. So the question that was asked earlier is, I'm just scrolling back.
Yeah, Paul, let me just jump in here. Thanks again for the talk. And actually, thanks a lot for sharing the questions to think about when mapping an employee onboarding experience, because that's, a great way to actually get into the mindset of what to do, where to start. And these questions were a great asset to have, I guess. And yeah, the question was by Tom here. How do you avoid a one-size-fits-all story?
Yeah. So I might partially answer that when I was talking as well. So I was talking about like you want to make like that foundational journey of start with that foundation. Another great analogy here, I love to make use of, you probably noticed, I like to make use of metaphors and analogies throughout. So I think another great way to think about your journey map, but specifically if we're talking onboarding, is thinking about it like a food menu. What I mean by that is think about what portion your main course, like what does everyone in the organization gets in this journey? If we're just focusing on onboarding. So it doesn't matter if someone's starting, whether just like a junior position right out of university, or they're coming in a vice president position, if they're, software developer, legal, finance, HR. What's something that everyone gets through talk about onboard? What do they get regardless? Like they learn about the values of the organization, they get matched with a buddy. Then you could start to get more specific, and this can also be seen as like the province view. But this is like thinking about the side dishes. So, what are aspects of software? People who join the software team, what do they get from their onboarding that, for example, someone in finance doesn't get, and this other way around too. So of course, if someone's in software, their onboarding is going to be like, oh, here's how we code here, here's our coding style, here's the technology we use. That information doesn't need to be given to finance people. Don't need to. Finance have their own set of things that they go through. And if you even want to get more specific, that's I know some people mentioned the chat there, the 30, 60, 90-day plan. That's a great way to really help create an experience that's even more attuned to create a more journey that's for themselves. So it's more, yeah, once you have that foundation first, and then identifying what area they come into, you could get more specific as time goes on. So that's my another one of my analogies is thinking of it like a food menu. The main course is what everyone gets. Depending on their role and department, that's where you could get more into the side dishes. And that's where you could get into more specific journey map of what they will go through. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question here. What is the best practice for a beginner to start with the user customer journey mapping, or maybe an employee one as well?
Yes. What is the best practice for a beginner to start with a user journey map? I think it's really, there's so many things that you could have in the journey map. I think would be starting with one thing just to see, kind of test the process out. So, I'm talking about onboarding here. There's like a million different things you could focus on onboarding. I think the big thing actually would be, the feelings and thought process. We're picking up those pain points or friction points. I know someone mentioned in the chat that come about from just like talking to people, or if we're using onboarding here, talk with someone who recently went through onboarding and just make notes of things they said of like, oh, maybe they wanted stronger mentorship, or oh, they didn't know who to go to for certain information. I think those are the things that are going to give you the most insights as well. And they're also like the best way to start, I would say. Yeah, if all the things like you could, start with, I think it's just kind of started with a conversation. I know it's super easy to, look at some of these templates you might have and be like, oh, this is really cool, or look at, all these things we would do with it. But it's more like just go have a conversation with someone. I think just to begin with, you just ask them one question to get started.
Great, thank you for sharing. And we actually, speaking of conversation, we have a question from Bill, and I guess I will top it up with Elise's. So, like all UX design processes, is it okay to test onboarding customer journey maps? What's the best way to gain feedback? And Elise here tops it up with, how do you get the feedback from new employees in a transparent and honest way? Should it be anonymous or just in a conversation?
Yeah. What's the best way to gain feedback? Perfect. I think it's going to depend on your organization too. From how do you get feedback from the transparent, honest way? Should be anonymous, or is it in conversation? Like I said, in a perfect world, people can give you that feedback. In some cases, one of the other list of onboarding ideas we talk about is the stay interview. Maybe there's a better term for it, but that's maybe like 90 days removed from when they started, maybe even 6 months. At that point, they're a little more comfortable in their role. They're kind of used to the organization. So if you ask someone like 7 days in, it's like, hey, how was that? They might kind of be like, oh yeah, it was pretty good. And then they might not give you all those insights. So there is a a value of waiting a little bit afterwards. It's kind of a fine, tricky balance, right? Like you want to get the feedback quicker, but you also want to get more of that transparent feedback. So the more time that they are at the organization, they're in an ideal world, they're going to be more likely to share with you. But every individual is different, right? Like there's, some individuals who are very blunt and upfront about things. That's totally great. And then some people just with their personalities are maybe a little bit shy or whatnot. So if they do want to just fill out like an anonymous feedback, that might be the way you have to do it. I always prefer person-to-person contact because if you just fill out a survey, it's like, okay, that's great. And that feedback is great. But if you sit down with someone and they mention something really interesting, then you could really start to dig in. But that comes back to the 5 whys. Those things are a lot harder to do if it's just like them filling out an anonymous survey. But again, in the perfect world, that might not be the case. So it's going to depend. But if you give them more time to get settled into the organization, and they're more comfortable, then there's more of that probability that there's going to be a lot more transparency. But also, take their personality into consideration as well. That
Thank
answers your
you,
question.
Alice, Bill. I hope that answers your questions. We have another one from Joe here. How do traditional HR practices mesh with
Good
journey
question.
mapping?
Ooh, I like that. It sounds like maybe kind of a clash. It'd be a bit of a, I'm just trying to say, traditional practices, how some meshes with journey mapping. It's one of those things, yeah, I guess with some of the clients I've worked with, it's a lot of, has it ever been met with resistance? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I have been met with resistance, depending on the organization. Some are more, especially notice this here in Canada, people can be a little more resistant. I've found it, of course, a lot easier. And actually, I remember one time I was talking with one client, and it turned out they actually made use of journey mapping on the customer side with like the UX team, which they didn't know about, which I didn't know about. But once we discovered that, it was much easier process, right? Of like, oh, they've been making use of it, so why don't we take the process inward? Yeah, there typically is going to be some kind of resistance. I found in the last year or so, just due to everything, organizations have been a lot more open to trying new things, employee-led initiatives, for example, on other areas. So I found that's been less of an issue as time has gone on of getting that buy-in, especially in the last year, just because it's like, all right, well, things have completely changed. We got to try something new here. But it's always kind of finding that champion within the organization. In some cases, it's become a lot easier over the last year. But in some cases, it's you, for example, go talk with your UX team, your customer experience team. They might have something lying around, and seeing what they've done with it, might give, it's like, oh, okay, it works for customers, so why don't we try it with our employees as well? With some bit of tweaks here, a lot of the foundations are the same. And it also comes down to back where I mentioned that anyone that while HR and people and culture should be spearheading this, that anyone can really work on this. And the more insight you get from various areas, the better.
Okay, awesome. Joe, I hope that answers your question. And we've got time for one more. And this one
There was
is
one earlier. Yeah, go
from
ahead.
Tom here. Yeah, exactly. Would the feedback cycles vary with job types?
Would the feedback cycles vary with job types? And how can you do customer journey mapping without UX? I don't think you could. So feedback cycles vary with job types. Yeah, I guess that's a good question. I think, it depends on the nature of the work. So for example, like software development, something that's we're doing that. Sorry. Let me just see the question again. What feedback cycles vary with job types? I think, yeah, that could be more, it depends on the role. If something's more, quote unquote, traditional, as opposed to something that's a little more always kind of iterating. For example, software is always known as being iterative. So software development, that area might have quicker feedback cycles of what works and what doesn't. Something that's maybe more, I guess, I hate to say traditional, maybe something like finance, that might not be as much. The feedback cycle might be longer on that side of the table. So really, I guess it depends on the role, and I guess also it ties down to the individual too. Some people might take longer to, if there's someone newer to the organization, they might have a bit of that hesitation or might not be completely transparent. So it's going to vary on the area. And I guess also, yeah, UX side of things, or user experience design, they're more iterative. So you will get faster feedback from feedback cycle there, as opposed to let's say finance. I don't mean to pick on finance if anyone's in here, but it's just like one it's more traditional. So